Good evening. What we're seeing unfold in Venezuela is not just another geopolitical setback. It's a moment that exposes the deeper fractures within the US economic and political machine itself. For years, Washington has sought to shape the political destiny of Latin America through sanctions, covert operations, and the usual chorus of defending democracy. Yet in this latest clash, the American strategy has stumbled, and the consequences are reverberating far beyond Caracas. The confrontation in Venezuela underscores a profound shift in the structure of global power, the slow erosion of US economic dominance that has defined international relations since the end of World War II. For decades, the United States exercised control not only through military might, but more importantly, through its command over global finance. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, the foundation of trade and debt, giving Washington the ability to enforce compliance through economic measures alone. Sanctions, loans, and aid packages served as tools of influence, shaping political outcomes in other nations without the need for direct intervention. But that system is now showing signs of fatigue. The Venezuelan clash has revealed that economic coercion is no longer as effective as it once was. Nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia are beginning to understand that dependence on the US-dominated financial order comes at the cost of their own sovereignty. As Venezuela resists external pressure, it symbolizes a growing global sentiment, the belief that alternatives exist. Countries are turning to regional trade agreements, bilateral currency swaps, and partnerships with emerging powers to reduce exposure to the dollar's volatility and Washington's conditions. This shift represents more than a diplomatic setback. It signals a structural transformation in the world economy. The institutions that once projected American economic ideology from the IMF to the World Bank are facing legitimacy crisis. Meanwhile, China's rise, the strengthening of BRICS, and new digital and resource-based currencies are offering credible alternatives to the old order. The Venezuela episode thus reflects a deeper reality. The tools that sustained US dominance are losing their power, and the rest of the world is beginning to construct an economic landscape where Washington's approval is no longer the final word. The events in Venezuela reveal the mounting consequences of America's long-standing pattern of imperial overreach. For decades, the United States has sought to maintain a global presence that stretches far beyond its capacity to sustain it. Endless military commitments, sprawling diplomatic entanglements, and economic interventions have created a system where the cost of dominance has begun to outweigh its benefits. The Venezuelan setback serves as a reminder that empire, no matter how powerful, eventually reaches its limits. The US has poured immense resources into maintaining influence abroad while neglecting the mounting inequalities and infrastructural decay within its own borders. This overextension has produced not strength but vulnerability. Each foreign confrontation demands political attention, financial investment, and moral justification, all of which erode domestic stability. The pattern is familiar. Washington seeks to shape other nations' destinies under the banner of democracy, yet these efforts often result in backlash, resistance, and failure. In Venezuela's case, the attempt to dictate economic and political outcomes collided with a regional shift toward self-determination and a refusal to yield to outside pressure. The defeat was not only diplomatic but symbolic. An empire discovering that the tools of coercion no longer guarantee obedience. At home, the contradictions grow sharper. While billions are spent on geopolitical maneuvering, the American working class faces stagnating wages, unaffordable health care, and declining public services. The rhetoric of global leadership masks the reality of a society where wealth is concentrated in the hands of corporations and the military-industrial complex. The clash in Venezuela therefore exposes more than a foreign policy failure. It exposes the internal decay that results from a nation prioritizing global domination over domestic renewal. Imperial overreach has reached a breaking point where the pursuit of control abroad deepens the crisis of inequality and disillusionment within. The outcome in Venezuela signals a wider transformation in the global balance of power, one that has been developing quietly over the last 2 decades. The post-Cold War era, dominated by US influence, is steadily giving way to a multipolar world where emerging economies are asserting their independence and demanding equal participation in global decision making. The assumption that Washington could define political and economic norms across Latin America, Asia, and Africa is no longer sustainable. Countries once treated as peripheral players in the world economy are now forming strategic alliances and regional blocs designed to protect their sovereignty and secure their resources on their own terms. In Latin America, this change is particularly visible. The long history of foreign intervention, both economic and political, has fostered a collective determination to resist outside control. Venezuela's defiance represents a wider regional awakening, nations exploring new partnerships, trading beyond the US sphere, and challenging the narrative that progress must follow the American model. The increasing influence of China, Russia, and regional coalitions such as CLA and BRICE has provided alternative sources of trade, investment, and security. This diversification of power gives countries the space to pursue their own political paths without automatically aligning with Washington's interests. This shift is not merely geopolitical, it's deeply economic. The control once exercised through the US dollar, international loans, and sanctions is eroding as nations build financial frameworks that bypass Western institutions. Technology, energy resources, and strategic cooperation have become the new tools of empowerment. The clash in Venezuela, therefore, is more than a contest of ideology. It is a marker of the world's transition toward a more balanced order. Power is dispersing, and nations long suppressed under the weight of US influence are beginning to stand on equal ground. The use of economic sanctions as a primary instrument of US foreign policy has long been portrayed as a non-violent and morally justified alternative to military intervention. Yet, in practice, it has become a tool of economic warfare, one that increasingly fails to achieve its objectives. The Venezuelan confrontation has revealed the declining effectiveness of this strategy. Decades ago, when the global economy was tightly bound to the dollar and US-led institutions, sanctions could cripple a nation by cutting it off from trade and finance. Today, the world is more interconnected, technologically advanced, and less dependent on Washington's approval. The same tactics that once enforced submission now inspire resistance and innovation. Sanctions imposed on Venezuela were intended to isolate its economy and force political change. Instead, they pushed the country to diversify its partnerships and explore new trade networks. China, Russia, and regional allies stepped in, providing economic lifelines and demonstrating that the US cannot unilaterally dictate who trades with whom. The result has been the gradual weakening of the sanctions' impact and the strengthening of alternative systems of exchange. What once served as a demonstration of American power now exposes its limits. Moreover, sanctions have unintended consequences that reach far beyond their targets. They devastate ordinary citizens, deepen poverty, and create humanitarian crises that undermine the moral legitimacy of the policy itself. At the same time, they encourage nations to build independent financial infrastructures, digital currencies, and trade agreements that bypass the US entirely. The Venezuelan episode reflects this evolution, an acknowledgement that the old methods of coercion are losing their grip. As the world adapts, the sanction strategy no longer represents dominance, but desperation, a sign of an empire struggling to maintain influence through economic punishment rather than genuine cooperation. the defeat abroad mirrors the contradictions festering within the United States itself. Contradictions born of an economy that prioritizes corporate profits and global dominance over the well-being of its own people. The US projects power across the world while millions at home face stagnant wages, job insecurity, unaffordable housing, and decaying public infrastructure. The clash in Venezuela highlights the deep irony of a nation spending billions to shape foreign governments while struggling to provide healthcare, education, and stability for its citizens. This disconnect between external ambition and internal neglect lies at the core of America's current crisis. The vast resources poured into military budgets, intelligence operations, and overseas interventions could easily fund programs that uplift the American working class. Instead, those funds reinforce a system that benefits the elite, the defense contractors, financial institutions, and multinational corporations that profit from global instability. Every attempt to assert control abroad, such as the Venezuelan episode, serves as a reminder that US foreign policy is often driven by economic interests, particularly in energy and finance, rather than by democratic ideals. The rhetoric of freedom and human rights functions as a mask for policies that protect corporate access to markets and resources. Meanwhile, the domestic consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. Public disillusionment grows as workers realize that the so-called victories of empire bring them nothing but debt and insecurity. The social fabric frays as inequality deepens, and the promise of shared prosperity fades into nostalgia. The failure in Venezuela then is not just a diplomatic embarrassment. It is a mirror reflecting the imbalance at home. An economy that cannot meet its people's needs will inevitably struggle to sustain power abroad. The contradictions of capitalism, long exported outward, are now returning to confront the empire from within. The struggle over Venezuela signals a broader historical moment, the emergence of a world no longer defined by a single dominant power, but by multiple centers of influence. The US, once the unchallenged architect of the global order, now finds itself contending with a reality it helped create: the diffusion of power across nations that have grown economically and politically independent. The defeat in Venezuela reflects this changing order where alliances are shifting and the authority of the American model is steadily eroding. What was once a unipolar world governed by the dollar, US corporations, and Western institutions is now giving way to a multipolar landscape shaped by new coalitions and economic experiments. Across the global South, countries are rejecting the notion that development must follow Washington's prescriptions. Instead, they are embracing partnerships that prioritize mutual benefit over subordination. Initiatives like BRICS expansion, regional development banks, and trade in local currencies are dismantling the financial hierarchies that long favored the US. These changes are not happening overnight, but they signal a deep structural transformation. The Venezuelan defiance, supported by nations willing to challenge American sanctions, embodies this growing confidence among states that once operated on the periphery of global power. At the same time, this emerging order reflects an ideological shift. Economic sovereignty, resource control, and regional cooperation are becoming the foundations of legitimacy, replacing the illusion of US-led globalization as the only path forward. America's position on the back foot is not merely about one political setback, but about the decline of a worldview centered on dominance. The new era taking shape is messy, contested, and uncertain, yet it carries within it the seeds of balance. A world where no single empire defines the rules, and power must finally negotiate rather than dictate. So perhaps this defeat in Venezuela isn't an isolated event. Maybe it's a symptom, a sign of a deeper reckoning. An empire stretched thin, an economy serving fewer and fewer at the top, and a global order that's learning to move on without America at the helm.